British Columbia's NDP government announced in September that it would defer logging on 353,000 hectares of old-growth forest, which was called for by a two-person strategic old-growth review panel. The government's move came shortly before Premier John Horgan called his controversial snap election. Now, recently, we interviewed independent scientist Karen Price. She has a PhD in behavioral ecology. She is an expert on old-growth forests. Karen lives remotely in British Columbia, so her video signal is very weak. You're only going to hear Karen's voice, but what she says, we believe, is very important. Independent scientist Karen Price says the NDP's response to the panel's review of old growth in the province was disturbing because it includes what's essentially a lie. Price, along with another scientist and a forester, had conducted their own months-long study of BC's old growth, which included extensive examinations of the government's own documents, and had turned their research over to the panel. First among the government panel's key findings was this unequivocal statement: the priorities that currently drive our forest management system are backwards. Rather than determine what must be done to maintain ecosystem health and resilience, and then what social and economic benefits we can derive within that guidance, we often do the opposite.
While we would grade the strategic review an A, we figured that the initial response at that time in September from the government really deserved a D. It was missing a lot of the key elements. It was abysmal. So if we see this as a starting point rather than an end point, then it doesn't get a fail, it gets a D.
But you just called it abysmal, didn't you?
I did.
Why?
What was worrying about it was that it really missed the most important of the recommendations of the old growth panel when it comes to changing the way that we manage forest, was to declare the conservation of ecosystem health and biodiversity of BC's forests as an overarching priority. If we did that, that would really be paradigm shifting. It would be new and holistic. Now, while the government claimed that their change was going to be paradigm shifting, new and holistic, they missed that piece. And without that piece, we're not going to see any change because this is foundational. So this is really what we need to move forest management beyond simple rules that place minimizing impact to timber supply at the apex.
Basically giving industry what it wants, which is to, as you just noted, minimize the possibility of shortages of the timber supply.
Yes, so our current policy in the forest practices and planning regulation states that we will try to maintain biodiversity, providing that it does not unduly impact BC's timber supply. So in terms of setting aside old forest, you're only allowed to set aside a maximum of 4% impact to timber supply. In setting aside areas for wildlife habitat, you're only allowed to impact timber supply by 1%. So timber clearly has a veto over these other values.
That's a fairly discouraging thing, I think, for our viewers to hear at a time when the climate crisis is on everybody's mind, if they're conscious at all, and the importance of nature-based solutions can't be overstated. So would you talk to me about that?
Yes, I could. So we're in the middle of a climate crisis as well as a biodiversity crisis. Protection of old growth forest has the potential to help with both of these crises. So if we want to think about carbon, old forests, particularly highly productive old forests, have been amassing carbon for centuries and millennia. In some cases, we have forests that have been undisturbed since glaciation. Essentially, it's a carbon storage facility. And the best thing we can do right now for mitigating climate change in terms of forest management has nothing to do with planting trees. Planting trees, new trees, don't build carbon for at least the first 30 years. And that's way too late to do anything. The best thing we can do is to keep productive, wet old forests where they stand. Leave them upright. They're storing carbon. If we leave this old growth standing, there's a lesser chance of floods. As I mentioned, they resist wildfires. So for a number of reasons, both mitigation and climate adaptation, we should be leaving these forests standing in place.
I'd like to talk now about what you and your colleagues call the heart of the government's response. And that's, of course, to the Old Growth Strategic Review. What is the heart of it? What really got you when you started looking at the numbers they were putting out?
So the heart of the report was a claim that they were deferring harvest on 353,000 hectares of BC's old growth. And so we went, okay, well, deferring, that's not protecting, but I can understand. That makes sense. We need to have land use planning. Once we managed to actually find outlines of these areas, we decided to analyze what type of forest was in there. And we found that of this 350,000 plus hectares of quotations here, old forest, a quarter of it wasn't classified as forested. So if it has trees, they're stunted at best.
What about the other 3/4 of that 350,000 hectare area?
There's another quarter that is forested, but it's not old. So it includes new clear cuts. So again, half of this area in total is not old forest, as the government claimed it was.
All right, so that leaves us with the last half. What's that?
If we look at the last half, most of this area is low productivity forest. So when we actually look at the area of productive forest that most people think about when they think of old growth, big trees, the kind that the old growth strategic panel said was at high risk of biodiversity loss and should be protected immediately. Out of our 353,000 hectares of, in quotes, old forest deferral, there's only 3,800 hectares of productive old forest of the type identified as needing immediate action by the panel that's not already in a no harvest zone. So we're talking about 1%.
Wow. Now listen, I've been at this game of reporting on environmental issues for a long time. This sounds like a lot of smoke and mirrors to me on the government part. What's your reaction to that?
I wish that I could trust them. I want to say that I think that the forest minister tried to do what he could, but with policy that puts timber first, it was too difficult, especially coming up to an election, to do anything more than grab some pieces that were already in process and put those in as a statement that, yes, we are responding to the old growth panel. The part that's a little bit more concerning to me is that now we're into a full NDP government now, and Premier Horgan committed to implement all of the recommendations of the Old Growth Strategic Panel. And if we look at Minister Conroy's mandate letter, it does indeed include direction to, quoting here, implement the recommendations of the Old Growth Strategic Review in collaboration with Indigenous leaders, labor, industry, and environmental groups to protect more old growth stands, in addition to the 353,000 hectares protected in September 2020. I find this a disturbing statement because it includes what's essentially a lie, and what government now knows is a lie. The 353,000 hectares, A, isn't actually protected. It's deferred harvest for 2 years. B, it's not actually old forest, and they now know this because they've been provided with the analysis. So I find it troubling that they're claiming that this is something they've done. And then the part that troubles me even more is the way the sentence is worded. It's implementing the recommendations ... to protect more old growth stands. That's not the biggest piece within the strategic panel review. The piece that needs to be in there is to shift our paradigm from one of timber first to one where we put ecosystem health and biodiversity as a priority. And that's not anywhere in here. The other thing is that we've known about this for more than 4 decades. We've known that we were going to run out of old growth. We've known that the policy is to cut everything that's not protected. And now we're essentially running right at the cliff. The cliff is at our feet, and we're continuing with the same policy.
It's interesting that you talk about this ongoing for 4 decades, this inability to come to terms with the reality of an environmental limit. That's essentially what you're saying. Because this also parallels in time frame the same kind of pushing aside the pressures that we all knew we were facing because of the climate crisis. And that's another cliff, isn't it?
Exactly. Yes, and personally, I feel we've already jumped off that one.
Why is that, Karen?
I have very little hope that anything aside from revolution is going to change our policies quickly enough that we're able to reduce our climate impact to a level where the impacts are non-catastrophic.
As we noted earlier, our request for an interview with Minister Conroy was turned down. We also requested an interview with Premier John Horgan and never received an answer. But we at XRTV believe the public record speaks loudly and clearly. Perhaps that's why they don't want to speak at all. Thank you so much for joining us. Take care.